Hi guys, Mrs. Turner here with your next installment of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I have permission from Scholastic to read this to you guys. When we left off, Edmund was tied to the tree, the witch was sharpening her knife, and it seemed like something really bad was going to happen. So let's find out. At that very moment, he heard loud shouts from every direction, a drumming of hooves and a beating of wings, a scream from the witch, confusion all round him, and then he found he was being untied. Strong arms were round him, and he heard a big, kind voices saying things like, "Let him lie down, give him some wine, drink this, steady now, you'll be all right in a minute." Then he heard the voices of people who were not talking to him but to one another, and they were saying things like, "Who's got the witch? I thought you had her. I didn't see her after I knocked the knife out of her hand. I was after the dwarf. Do you mean to say she's escaped?" "A chap can't mind everything at once. What's that?" "Oh, sorry, it's only an old stump." But just at this point, Edmund went off in a deep faint. Here's a little picture. Presently, the centaurs and unicorns and deer and birds, they were, of course, the rescue party which Aslan had sent in the last chapter, all set off to go back to the stone table, carrying Edmund with them. But if they could have seen what happened in that valley after they had gone, I think they might have been surprised. It was perfectly still, and presently the moon grew bright. If you had been there, you would have seen the moonlight shining on an old tree stump and on a fair-sized boulder. But if you had gone on looking, you would have gradually have begun to think that there was something odd about both the stump and the boulder. And next you would have thought that the stump didn't look really remarkably like a little fat man crouching on the ground. And if you had watched long enough, you would have seen the stump walk across to the boulder and the boulder sit up and began talking to the stump. For in reality, the stump and the boulder were simply the witch and the dwarf. For it was part of her magic that she could make things look like what they aren't, and she had the presence of mind to do so at that very moment when the knife was knocked out of her hand. She kept hold of her wand so it had been kept safe. She had kept hold of her wand so it had been kept safe too. When the other children woke up next morning, they had been sleeping on piles of cushions in the pavilion, and the first thing they heard from Mrs. Beaver was that their brother had been rescued and brought into camp late last night, and was at that moment with Aslan. As soon as they had breakfasted, they all went out, and there they saw Aslan and Edmund walking together in the dewy grass, apart from the rest of the court. There is no need to tell you, and no one ever heard what Aslan was saying, but it was a conversation which Edmund never forgot. As the others drew nearer, Aslan turned to meet them, bringing Edmund with him. "Here is your brother," he said, "and there is no need to talk to him about what is past." Edmund shook hands with each of the others and said to each of them in turn, "I'm sorry," and everyone said, "That's all right." And then everyone wanted very hard to say something which would make it quite clear they were all friends with him again, something ordinary and natural, and of course no one could think of anything in the world to say. But before they had time to feel awkward, one of the leopards approached Aslan and said, "Sire, there is a messenger from the enemy who craves audience." "Let him approach," said Aslan. The leopard went away and soon returned leading the witch's dwarf. "What is your message, son of earth?" asked Aslan. "The Queen of Narnia and Empress of the Lone Islands desires safe conduct to come and speak with you," said the dwarf, "on a matter which is as much to your advantage as to her." "Queen of Narnia, indeed," said Mrs. Beaver. "Of all the cheek." "Peace, Beaver," said Aslan. "All names will soon be restored to their proper owners. In the meantime, we will not dispute about them. Tell your mistress, son of earth, that I grant her safe conduct on condition that she leaves her wand behind her at the great oak." This was agreed to, and 2 leopards went back with the dwarf to see what the conditions were properly carried out. "But supposing she turns the 2 leopards into stone," whispered Lucy to Peter. I think the same idea had occurred to the leopards themselves. At any rate, as they walked off, their fur was all standing up on their backs, and their tails were bristling like a cat's when they see a strange dog. "It'll be all right," whispered Peter in reply. "He wouldn't send them if it weren't." A few minutes later, the witch herself walked out on to the top of the hill and came straight across and stood before Aslan. The 3 children, who had not seen her before, felt shoulders shudders running down their backs at the sight of her face, and there were low growls among all the animals present. Though it was bright sunshine, everyone felt suddenly cold. The only two people present who seemed to be quite at their ease was Aslan and the witch herself. It was the oddest thing to see those two faces, the golden face and the dead white face, so close together. Not that the witch looked Aslan exactly in the eyes. Mrs. Beaver particularly noticed this. "You have a traitor there, Aslan," said the witch. Of course, everyone present knew that she meant Edmund, but Edmund had got past thinking about himself after all he had been through and after the talk he'd had that morning. He just went on looking at Aslan. It didn't seem to matter what the witch said. "Well," said Aslan, "his offense was not against you." "Have you forgotten the deep magic?" asked the witch. "Let us say I have forgotten it," answered Aslan gravely. "Tell us of this deep magic." "Tell you?" said the witch, her voice growing suddenly shriller. "Tell you what is written on the very table of stone which stands beside us? Tell you what is written in letters deep as a spear is long on the firestones on the secret hill? Tell you what is engraved on the scepter of the emperor beyond the sea? You at least know the magic which the emperor put into Narnia at the very beginning. You know that every traitor belongs to me as my lawful prey, and that for every treachery I have the right to kill." "Oh," said Mr. Beaver, "so that's how you came to imagine yourself a queen, because you were the emperor's hangman. I see." "Peace, Beaver," said Aslan with a very low growl. "And so," continued the witch, "that human creature is mine. His life is forfeit to me. His blood is my property." "Come and take it then," said the bull with a man's head and a great bellowing voice. "Fool," said the witch with a savage smile that was almost a snarl. "Do you really think your master can rob me of my rights by mere force? He knows the deep magic. Better than that, he knows that unless I have blood, as the law says, all Narnia will be overturned and perish in fire and water." "It is very true," said Aslan. "I do not deny it." "Oh, Aslan," whispered Susan in the lion's ear, "can't we, you won't, will you? Can't we do something about the deep magic? Isn't there something you can work against it?" "Work against the emperor's magic?" said Aslan, turning to her with something like a frown on his face. And nobody ever made that suggestion to him. Edmund was on the other side of Aslan, looking all the time at Aslan's face. He felt a choking feeling and wondered if he ought to say something, but a moment later he felt that he was not expected to do anything except to wait and do what he was told. "Fall back, all of you," said Aslan, "and I will talk to the witch alone." They all obeyed. It was a terrible time, this waiting and wondering, while the lion and the witch talked earnestly together in low voices. Lucy said, "Oh, Edmund," and began to cry. Peter stood with his back to the others, looking out at the distant sea. The beavers stood holding each other's paws with their heads bowed. The centaurs stamped easily with their hooves, but everyone became perfectly still in the end, so that you noticed every small sound, like a bumblebee flying past, or the birds in the forest down below them, or the wind rustling the leaves, and still the talk between Aslan and the White Witch went on. Here they are. That's the witch and Aslan. At last they heard Aslan's face. "You can all come back," he said. "I have settled the matter. She has renounced the claim to your brother's blood." And all over the hill there was a noise as if everyone had been holding their breath, and now began breathing again, and then a murmur of talk. The witch was just turning away with a look of fierce joy on her face when she stopped and said, "But how do I know this promise will be kept?" "Arrrrrr!" roared Aslan, half rising from his throne, and his great mouth opened wider and wider, and the roar grew louder and louder, and the witch, after staring for a moment with her lips wide apart, picked up her skirts and fairly ran for her life. Chapter 14. The Triumph of the Witch. Yeah, I guess I ended it in the middle of 13 last time. It was a long chapter. As soon as the witch had gone, Aslan said, "We must move from this place at once. It will be wanted for another purpose. We shall encamp tonight at the fords of Baruna." Of course, everyone was dying to ask him how he had arranged matters with the witch, but his face was stern, and everybody's ears were still ringing with the sound of his roar, so nobody dared. After a meal which was taken in the open air on the hilltop, for the sun had got strong by now and dried the grass, they were busy for a while taking the pavilion down and packing things up. Before 2 o'clock, they were on the march and set off in a northeasterly direction, walking at an easy pace, for they had not far to go. During the first part of the journey, Aslan explained to Peter his plan of the campaign. As soon as she has finished her business in these parts, he said, the witch and her crew will almost certainly fall back to her house and prepare for a siege. You may or may not be able to cut her off and prevent her from reaching it. He then went on to outline 2 plans of battle, one for fighting the witch and her people in the woods, and another for assaulting her castle. And all the time he was advising Peter how to conduct the operation, saying things like, you must put your centaurs in such and such place, or you must post scouts to see that she doesn't do so-and-so, till at last Peter said, but you'll be there yourself, Aslan. I can give you no promise of that, answered the lion, and he continued giving Peter his instructions. For the last part of the journey, it was Susan and Lucy who saw most of him. He did not talk very much and seemed to them to be sad. It was still afternoon when they came down to a place where the river valley had widened out and the river was broad and shallow. This was the fords of Baruna, and Aslan gave orders to halt on the side of the water. But Peter said, wouldn't it be better to camp on the far side for fear she should try a night attack or anything? Aslan, who had seemed to have been thinking about something else, roused himself with a shake of his magnificent mane and said, what's that? Peter said it all over again. No, said Aslan in a dull voice, as if it didn't matter. No, she will not make an attack tonight. And then he sighed deeply. But presently he added, all the same, it was well thought of. This is how a soldier ought to think. But it doesn't really matter. So they proceeded to pitch their camp. Aslan's mood affected everyone that evening. Peter was feeling uncomfortable, too, at the idea of fighting the battle on his own. The news that Aslan might not be there had come as a great shock to him. Supper that evening was a quiet meal. Everyone felt how different it had been last night, or even that morning. It was as if the good times, having just begun, were already drawing to their end. This feeling affected Susan so much that she couldn't go to sleep when she went to bed, and after she had lain counting sheep and turning over and over, she heard Lucy give a long sigh and turned over just beside her in the darkness. Can't you sleep either? Said Susan. No, said Lucy, I thought you were asleep. I say, Susan. What? I have the most horrible feeling, as if something were hanging over us. Have you? Because as a matter of fact, so have I. Something about Aslan, either some dreadful thing that is going to happen to him or something dreadful that he's going to do. There's been something wrong with him all afternoon, said Susan. Lucy, what was that he said about not being with us at the battle? You don't think he could be stealing away and leaving us tonight, do you? Where is he now? Said Lucy. Is he here in the pavilion? I don't think so. Susan, let's go outside and have a look around. We might see him. All right, let's, said Susan. We might just as well be doing that as lying awake here. Very quietly, the 2 girls groped their way among the other sleepers and crept out of the tent. The moonlight was bright and everything was quite still except for the noise of the river chattering over the stones. Then Lucy suddenly caught Lucy's arm. Then Susan suddenly caught Lucy's arm and said, Look! On the far side of the camping ground, just where the trees began, they saw the lion slowly walking away from them into the wood. Without a word, they both followed him. He led them up a steep slope out of the river valley and then slightly to the right, apparently by the very same route which they had used that afternoon in coming from the hill of the stone table. On and on he led them, into the dark shadows and out into the pale moonlight, getting their feet wet with the heavy dew. He looked somewhere different from the Aslan they knew. His tail and his head hung low, and he walked slowly as if they were very, very tired. Then, when they were crossing a wide open place where there was no shadows for them to hide in, he stopped and looked around. It was no good trying to run away, so they came towards him. When they were closer, he said, Oh, children, why are you following me? We couldn't sleep, said Lucy, and they felt sure she'd need to say no more, and that Aslan knew all they had been thinking. Please, may we come with you wherever you are going? Well, said Aslan, and he seemed to be thinking. Then he said, I should be glad for company tonight. Yes, you may come, if you will promise to stop when I tell you, and after that leave me to go on alone. Oh, thank you, and we will, said the two girls. Forward they went again, and one of the girls walked on each side of the lion, and how slowly he walked, and his great royal head drooped so that his nose nearly touched the grass. Presently he stumbled and gave a low moan. Aslan, dear Aslan, said Lucy, what is wrong? Can you tell us? Are you ill, dear Aslan? Asked Susan. No, said Aslan. I am sad and lonely. Lay your hands on my mane so that I can feel you are there, and let us walk like that. And so the girls did what they would never have dared to do without his permission, but what they had longed to do ever since they first saw him, bury their cold hands in the beautiful sea of fur and stroke it, and so doing walked with him. And presently they saw they were going with him on the slope of the hill on which the stone table stood. They went up on the side where the trees came furthest up, and when they got to the last tree, it was the one that had some bushes about it, Aslan stopped and said, Oh, children, children, here you must stop, and whatever happens, do not let yourselves be seen. Farewell. And both girls cried bitterly, though they hardly knew why, and clung to the lion and kissed his mane and his nose and his paws and his great sad eyes. Then he turned from them and walked out on the top of the hill, and Lucy and Susan, crouching in the bushes, looked after him, and this is what they saw. A great crowd of people were standing all round the stone table, and though the moon was shining, many of them carried torches which burned with evil-looking red flames and black smoke. But such people, ogres with monstrous teeth, and wolves, and bull-headed men, spirits of evil trees and poisonous plants, and other creatures whom I won't describe, because if I did, the grown-ups would probably not let you read this book. Cruels and hags, incubuses, wraiths, horrors, ifrits, sprites, orkneys, woozes, and ettins. In fact, here were all of those who were on the witch's side and whom the wolf had summoned at her command. And right in the middle, standing by the table, was the witch herself. A howl and a gibber of dismay went up from the creatures when they first saw the great lion pacing towards them, and for a moment even the witch herself seemed to be struck with fear. Then she recovered herself and gave a wild, fierce laugh. The fool, she cried, the fool has come. Bind him fast. Lucy and Susan held their breaths, waiting for Aslan's roar and his spring upon his enemies, but it never came. 4 hags, grinning and leering, yet also at first hanging back and half afraid of what they had to do, had approached him. Bind him, I say, repeated the white witch. The hags made a dart at him and shrieked with triumph when they found that he'd made no resistance at all. Then others, evil dwarfs and apes, rushed in to help them, and between them they rolled the huge lion over on his back and tied all 4 paws together, shouting and cheering as if they had done something brave, though had the lion chosen, one of those paws would have been the death of them all. But he made no noise, even when the enemies, straining and tugging, pulled the cord so tight they had cut into his flesh. Then they began to drag him towards the stone table. Here is a picture of all the bad guys and Aslan right in the middle. Stop, said the witch. Let him first be shaved. Another roar of mean laughter went up from her followers as an ogre with a pair of shears came forward and squatted down by Aslan's head. Snip, snip, snip went the shears, and masses of curling gold began to fall to the ground. Then the ogre stood back, and the children, watching from their hiding place, could see the face of Aslan looking all small and different without its mane. The enemies also saw the difference. Why, he's only a great cat, after all, cried one. Is that what we're afraid of, said another. And they surged around Aslan, jeering at him, saying things like, Puss, puss, poor pussy, and how many mice have you caught today, cat? And would you like a saucer of milk, pussums? Oh, how can they, said Lucy, tears streaming down her cheeks. The brutes, the brutes. For now that the first shock was over on the shorn face of Aslan, the shorn face of Aslan looked to her braver and more beautiful and more patient than ever. Muzzle him, said the witch. And even now, as they worked about his face, putting on the muzzle, one bite from his jaws would have cost 2 or 3 of them their hands, but he never moved. And this seemed to enrage all the rabble. Everyone was at him now. Those who had been afraid to come near him even after he was bound began to find their courage. And for a few minutes the two girls could not even see him. So thickly was he surrounded by the whole crowd of creatures, kicking him, hitting him, spitting on him, jeering at him. At last the rabble had had enough of this. They began to drag the bound and muzzled lion to the stone table, some pulling and some pushing. He was so huge that even when they got him there, it took all their efforts to hoist him onto the surface of it. Then there was more tying and tightening of the cords. The cowards, sobbed Susan. Are they still afraid of him even now? When once Aslan had been tied, and tied so that he was really a mass of cords, on the flat stone, a hush fell over the crowd. 4 hags, holding 4 torches, stood at the corner of the tables. The witch bared her arms as she had bared them the previous night when it had been Edmund instead of Aslan. Then she began to whet her knife. It looked to the children, when the gleam of the torchlight fell on it, as if the knife were made of stone, not of steel, and it was of a strange and evil shape. At last she drew near. She stood by Aslan's head. Her face was working and twitching with passion, but his looked up at the sky, still quiet, neither angry nor afraid, but a little sad. Then, just before she gave the blow, she stooped down and said in a quivering voice, "And now who has won? Fool, do you think that by all of this you would save the human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, as our pact was, and so the deep magic will be appeased. But when you are dead, what will prevent me from killing him as well? And who will take him out of my hand? Then? Understand that you have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your own life, and you have not saved his. In that knowledge, despair and die." The children did not see the actual moment of the killing. They couldn't bear to look and had covered their eyes. Chapter 15. Deeper magic from before the dawn of time. While the 2 girls stood crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now follow me all, we will set out about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that a great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children were a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them with a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs, and overheard there went a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear. But now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. Here's a picture of the creatures. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again. And then again were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried. And after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying and kissed it and fondled it and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you've been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to those 2. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm. They hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed 2 things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little gray things. Ah, said Susan from the other side of the table. How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts! And she raised her hand to frighten them away. Wait, said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely still. Can you see what they're doing? Both girls bent down and stared. I do believe, said Susan, but how strange. They're nibbling away the cords. That's what I thought, said Lucy. I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they didn't realize he's dead. They think it'll do them some good untying him. Here they are. Little mice right there. It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. At last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big, big one, low down in the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler. As the light grew, they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk about a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm, and oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment looking out towards the sea and Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment, from behind them, they heard a loud noise, a great crackling, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, 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 cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Here's a picture of the table. Broken. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it more magic? Yes, said a great voice behind their backs. It is more magic. They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown back, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan, cried both the children, staring up at him almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. You're not asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and the rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. Do I look it? He said. Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan, cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. It means, said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is magic deeper still, which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time, But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward. And now, oh yes, now, said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. Oh, children, said the lion, I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can. He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over to reach him. Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge, beautifully velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one had ever had except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. And now, said Aslan presently, to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears. And they did, and Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare to look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of them bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. Then he said, we have a long journey to go. You must ride on me. And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan, and with a great heave he rode beneath them, and they shot off faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that has happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever galloped on a horse? Think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of the great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of a horse, the soft roughness of golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on and on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smaller streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. And you are riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even in the downs, but right across Narnia, in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing cabins, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down, down, down again into wild valleys, and out into the acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down at the steep hillside at a castle. A little toy castle looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the line was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time even to ask themselves what it was, they were already on level with it. And now it was no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet towards it. The witch is home, he cried. Now, children, hold tight. Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any had yet made and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. And that's where we're going to end today. My next installment will be finishing the book. So I hope you guys are enjoying it. My Room 26 third graders, I miss you so much every day. I hope you have a nice spring break, being safe in your homes with your families. I will definitely post the next installment tomorrow. Of course, you can be enjoying this anytime you want because they're up on YouTube. And love you guys. Think about you all the time. Bye.